So, welcome everyone to Thursdays with Troy. As always, I'm Troy Lambert, mystery author, editor, super plotterer, and your host. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to E.G. Bateman, all the way from the UK. She is the author of the YA Urban Fantasy Faders series and co-author of the Legacy of the Shadow's Blood series with Michael Anderle. She's also a staff writer for Indie Author Magazine, which I love, the new magazine for indies at all stages of their careers, and there are some fantastic resources there. Welcome.
Thank you, Troy. How are you?
Fantastic. Now, what we're going to really talk about today is YA and new adult urban fantasy. Those are both obviously really extremely popular genres. But what we're really going to talk about is this idea of using like the story loop method and figuring out whether your story loops are open or closed to create tension in your story, to make sure that by the end you wrap everything up. And it just helps you keep your plots not only tighter, but it also helps you introduce tension and conflict and all of those type of things. So let's chat about that for just a second. For those who aren't familiar, what is a story loop and what do you mean by open and closed loops?
By open and closed loops, it's making sure that the questions that are asked throughout the story are answered in the story, or certainly in the book, or in the next book, or by the end of the series. So it's something that it's really important to keep a hold of, because nobody wants to get to the end of their series and realize they've left some huge open loops and angry readers.
Yes, and readers are generally not pleased by that. Readers, those questions that keep your reader reading, if you don't answer them at the end of the book, then we tend to get really upset with you, and you don't want your readers to throw your book or blame you for throwing their Kindle across the room, however they happen to be be reading them. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but touch a little deeper on why it's so important to close those loops of your story. You know, reader expectations, reader satisfaction.
Exactly.
But also,
that's exactly it. Is reader expectation for me. In my first series, I have received communications from people. What was this supposed to mean? Why did this never show up? And it was always intended to come in a further book, but I anticipated writing that for that next book a lot sooner. So I've been burned, and that's the important thing for me now, is reader expectation. I don't want to leave disappointed readers.
right. And so is that more important, do you think, in like new adult, young adult type things, or is it just important across the board, like just generally speaking?
I think it's definitely important across the board. And I did start writing in YA because I was fearful of putting myself out there, and thought, oh, maybe 14-year-olds will be kinder. I don't know why I thought that. I've got a 14-year-old. He's horrible. He's 24 now and he's still horrible.
Well, and that is something good to keep in mind, and also another thing to keep in mind about young adult and new adult is that there's a lot of adults that read that simply because
yes.
It tends to be cleaner and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So your readers can be pickier than what you expect them to be.
Yeah.
Obviously, with a series, you do want to leave some open loops because you want people to want to come in for the next book in the series. So what's that balance there that you maybe even what you're achieving with your new series is, what's the balance between wrapping everything up but leaving some? How much can you leave unsaid before you move on to the next book?
I imagine there's a science to it, and someone has figured this out. But really, I go on gut instinct. I'll close pretty much everything except for something I know will be answered in the final book of the series, or that I know I'll get to a little later, and it can be a little tease for them.
Well, yeah, there probably is. There's probably a science to it. We kind of say, you can leave part of the B story that runs through the whole series hanging or whatever. But, it's interesting to talk about, like, how much does a reader expect you to wrap up? Like the 3 rules for writing a novel. No one knows what they are, but there are 3 rules. So we'll just have to pretend that we know better than everyone else. So, well, right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share your Plottr file. And I think kind of the interesting aspect of this is the questions, because I'm assuming these questions is partly what triggers your story loop. So tell me about how you track your story loops in Plottr and how you make sure that they are closed before you end the book.
I've used Plottr in various different ways. In fact, it was Michael Anderley who introduced me to Plottr, and I thought, oh, that looks good. I'll get it and I'll have a go. But I didn't use it on the first book that we wrote together. But in the second and third, I was using it retrospectively, pretty much write most of the book and then go back into Plottr to see if I could catch anything that I'd missed out at that point. The last couple of books that I've written, I plot about half of the book and then export it to Scrivener and write up to that point, and then I go back and plot the rest of it. But the way of recording these questions or these open loops, the way I'm using them at the moment is adding that extra row on the table there, and I'll make a note every time there's something's come up that doesn't quite have an answer yet. I mean, there you'll see I just left it in the heading there. I don't know how much I can say because this is the last book that I had out.
Right, so yeah. We won't skip ahead to the end necessarily about the answers, but I think what's interesting is as we look at this scene card, really, and we pop it open, there's not really a lot here, just enough to trigger you to say, Eric and Millicent, this is a question, or where's Brian, or Lexi's mother. So, just to help people understand, this doesn't have to be super complicated. So does the green color here, does that mean that you've answered these questions?
Yes.
That you know that they're answered?
Yeah, they stay clear like the rest of it until the point at which answers start to pop in. And once I know I've answered a question in chapter 12 or chapter 14 or whatever, I'll go back to that question. And if there's several questions in there, I'll turn it amber. And when I get to all the questions, I'll turn it green, and I know they're all done.
That is a brilliant way of using that coloring in screens. And then I notice here kind of the same thing with the answers, is they're just very brief, just enough to let you know as the writer, yes, I answered that question. Is that the way you structure them all the time? Do you ever give yourself more detailed answers? Do you ever kind of go down that road, or do you just kind of leave it enough that I know I answered the question?
It depends on how complex the question is. If I get to the point where I don't understand my own comments, then yeah, I'd put more detail. Really, it's just for me, and it's just to make sure I catch them. And I've tried various different ways using Plottr of recording questions and answers, such as putting tags in and attributes and things like that. But I think that might be a good way if you've got a really convoluted series with loads of different plot lines and POVs, and you have to keep scrolling down to find your Q&As. I think at that point I might go into using the attributes or the tagging system to find them instead of putting them on a row. But I really do enjoy just having them right there where I can see them.
Right, and that's another very good point about Plottr. This is simply one way to track these story loops. I like the question and answer. We should back up and talk about like what a story loop actually is. That it's a question. Brandon Sanderson puts it, it's a promise that then you fulfill as you're writing the way to do that. But I like this. I also like the way you're using the day timeline to track the passage of time. If you get your time wrong, then your loops can be open because why this was supposed to happen on Thursday and it's happened on Wednesday. Or so tell us some other ways that you use Plottr to just keep track, the one timeline that you have, and then the actual day of the week. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I start every book on a Monday, and it doesn't necessarily even come up in the story. Nobody might say it's a Monday. It's just for my reference. Sometimes I'll add times in as well.
So tell us, how does Plottr work in with your co-writing process? Obviously, you're co-writing this series. So how does Plottr work with that? How does it help you do that? Or do you each have your own separate Plottr files?
My collaboration with Michael is more of a business collaboration. Occasionally, I would send him a Plottr file, and we'd have a Zoom and chat about that. But for the most part, like for the last few books, it's been like, off you go, you're fine, and I check in every now and again.
All right. Well, so besides the question and answer kind of timelines that we've looked at, do you have other ways that you just double check yourself and make sure everything's wrapped up by the end of the book, except for what you want to continue in the series?
Not really. I mean, like there was the other ways of trying to do the same thing. But I think it also helps that I go into Plottr and I plot half a book, and then I'll see where I am for the second half, and I go forwards and backwards from Plottr and Scrivener.
So you would say that you're kind of a blend between a discovery writer, because you plot half the book and then you discover the rest, and then you kind of go back and I
plot it in two chunks now. I don't plot it to death. I'll outline, do beats, whatever, because I am more of a natural pantser. So, and I'm trying my best. Plotter's helping me to see the way.
But yet it is interesting to see that even as a discovery writer, you're able to use Plottr to just give yourself a light guide. In other words, you don't have to go with 14 million tags and all those things to make Plottr work for you.
Exactly.
That's not the way it works at all. And I think that's a good thing for people to hear, is this is not that, not everybody has to go and dive super deep. You can just put yourself up a line of doing those type of things. So kind of some wrap-up questions. What would you recommend to someone who wants to kind of start playing around with story loops and making sure they're all open and closed? Or are there any resources you would recommend to them, things you'd recommend they start with, anything like that?
Book-wise, How to Write a Page Turner by Jordan Rosenfeld is excellent. That's a great book.
Good.
And get Plottr.
Get Plottr and use it. That's fantastic. That's a great free commercial we just got there. So what other resources, obviously besides Plottr and besides this one book, what other resources have allowed you to get where you are today, as far as even craft resources, business sources? What resources really brought you to where you are?
20 books to 50K has a massive place in my heart. I love the community. I love the no-nonsense approach, and so much information is in there. So much information. All you have to do is look for it, and
yes.
And if you can't find it, then ask a question.
I do love how supportive of those of you who don't know the 20 books to 50K community. Definitely look it up. I love how supportive they are. I love how supportive they are of their admins and all the people who are around them. It is a fantastic group to be a part of. It really, really is. So tell people where they can find you, like your website, social media, all that kind of information. We'll have you after this. You can go to the Facebook group and kind of drop that in the comments so people can stalk you and find out more about you and your books.
I will. I'm on Facebook, E.G. Bateman. My website is currently being built, but that will be egbatemanwrites.com.
Oh, excellent. Good, good, good.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I've got cornerdown.com as well, which is my imprint.
Okay, well, if you've ever watched Thursdays with Troy, you also know that there's always a question of the day. Of course, I'm sure you've been anticipating yours. And because you're from the UK, and I have a lot of friends from the UK, of course, there are us Americans have all kinds of questions for you. And so this is a two-part question. Is the first question is coffee or tea?
Coffee, 100% all the way.
Oh, man, I love you. There's some people in London I need you to get in touch with and really help them out a little bit. But, but okay, next question. Milk and sugar. Yes or no?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I've always been a milk and sugar girl, but I went on to keto recently, so it's black now.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate you sharing your viewpoint on story loops and open and closed loops. I think this is really helpful for people as a way to add tension to your story, but also to just make sure that at the end of your story, everything is wrapped up. If you come along a question along the way, make note of it somewhere in Plottr on a question plot line or something like that, and make sure before your story is up that you've answered that. So thanks everyone for joining us on Thursdays with Troy. And we will see you next Thursday for Thursdays with Troy. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.